Hello, welcome to this video and welcome to my channel. My name is Emma and today I'm going to be sharing with you my top 5 favorite podcasts. So this video is actually going to be the first in a series where I share with you my top 5 recent favorite podcasts. I am kind of a severe podcast addict. If I'm not listening to an audiobook, I can't survive without having a podcast on. And even podcast episodes that I've listened to several times before, I will go back and listen to all over again and get just as much joy as I did from them the first time around. So the series is going to be called My Podcast Addiction, and I recently, in the last 2 years or so, started listening to podcasts, and I've only recently kind of had the increase in listening time that I experienced today. So since I started listening to podcasts, it's taken me about 2 years to kind of accumulate these 5 favorites. There are a couple that I've listened to here and there that I've left out of this video, but they may be coming up again later. So when I have another set of 5 favorite podcasts, you will be seeing another video in this My Podcast Addiction series. So the first podcast I'm going to talk about is the number one, the only, the podcast that got me into podcasts, the podcast I listen to literally every day, even though I've listened to all of the episodes multiple times. It's My Favorite Murder by Kilgariff and Hardstark. My Favorite Murder is a true crime comedy podcast. It is my comfort podcast. Kilgariff and Hardstark have had an unimaginable effect on my life and my mental health journey and my personal growth journey with the things that they talk about outside of the true crime stories that they share. But in terms of the true crime and comedy element, every episode, every week, Karen and Georgia each individually share a story with one another that they then kind of release the tension of and debrief in a comedic way. They're both hilarious people who both have histories in performance up until they started the podcast. So what they say is that they both naturally deal with the horrors and tragedies of life through comedic relief, and so the combination of true crime and comedy just made sense for them. So My Favorite Murder has several hundred episodes out there on the internet. There are the mini-sodes that come out on Mondays that are around 25 to 30 minutes, where they will read listener stories that you email in to myfavoritemurder@gmail.com. And then on Thursdays, they post the full-length episodes with the stories that Karen and Georgia are reporting on. Because the Monday episodes are called minisodes, the Thursday episodes are often called maxisodes, which is just peak comedy. While I do love the minisodes, I want to share with you 5 of the full-length episodes that I absolutely adore. This is not in order of preference, but this is in order of posting. So episode 136 is called The Uninhibited. It's the first one I'm going to share with you. Karen reports on the murder of Stanford White, which is a salacious New York City celebrity murder that takes place in 1906, but has a story going back to the late 1800s that then builds to the murder in 1906. And Georgia shares the story of The Boys on the Tracks, which is a gross and tragic miscarriage of justice in which 2 teenage boys were murdered and the police basically ignored their case. Episode 199 is live at the Eventim Apollo in London, and Karen reports on the murderer Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, who murdered in Great Britain, in the US, and possibly in Canada. The jokes that Karen makes about this man's name are absolutely incredible. She's just, she's just the funniest person. Even though it has been proven to not be true, Dr. Neil Cream did confess to being Jack the Ripper at his execution, but it has since been proven that he was in Illinois at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, so that's just absolutely not true. And Georgia reports on the Enfield poltergeist, which is a ghost and haunting that terrorized a small family in a flat in Enfield in England, which also The Conjuring 2 is based on. Episode 203 is live at the Fox Theater in Atlanta. Georgia reports on the kidnapping of Barbara Mackle, which I believe is the kidnapping where she was a wealthy heiress to a fortune, and this man was looking to kidnap a woman that he thought would be able to sustain the terror and the torture, and so he chose Barbara Mackle. She was underground for 83 hours and she survived. Karen reports on the Barbie Bandits, who were two college girls who basically just tried to rob banks and failed miserably, and she makes so much fun of them. Episode 257 is called Monster Machine, and Karen reports on the revenge of Miriam Rodriguez, in which a mother whose daughter was murdered and who she believes her killers are still out there, but the police are not paying attention to her. She goes and tracks them down herself. Georgia reports on the happy face killer Keith Hunter Jesperson, who has 8 confirmed murders but has a potential of being linked to 185 murders. He left smiley faces on some mail and letters that he had sent to the police, which is why he's called the happy face killer. And then one of the most recent episodes that is available for the podcast is episode 290, Full Metal Recovery. It is one of the best episodes that I've ever heard, and it is one that I recommend for people who are just getting into the podcast. If you don't know where to start, I would start with Full Metal Recovery, because both of the stories that are told in this episode are not murder stories, they're not gruesome, but they are very impactful and very important stories. So Georgia tells the story of Nazi resistance fighter Irene Sendler, who was an incredible woman who completely was given absolutely no credit until, while doing a school project, a couple of teenage girls found her story in like the back recesses of a newspaper somewhere, and found this woman and ended up commemorating her life with such great passion and such joy. She smuggled children out of their homes, which were in places that were being occupied by the Nazis, and she did it successfully for many years, and she was able to save hundreds, if not thousands, of children. And then Karen reports on the Welsh crate man, Brian Robinson, who took a bad business deal in Australia. He had nothing and ended up agreeing to a one-way ticket and a job in Australia, got there and realized it was actually the worst thing that had ever happened to him, but he didn't have the money to get back, so he stuffed himself into a crate and took the whole journey that way. If any of those cases or just the premise of the podcast sounds interesting to you, I highly, highly recommend it. Please take my recommendations if you like, or go find an episode that you want to listen to, but I love My Favorite Murder more than anything. Next up on my list is a new favorite called The Midnight Library. So Mr. John Darling and Miranda Merrick are lifelong best friends who both live at the Midnight Library and keep the library up together. During the first episode of the podcast, Miranda and Mr. Darling decide to open up some of the rooms of their library one night a week for a public reading. So Miranda does these readings and she tells the historical truths behind creepy things in our world. So this will include mummified cats, the power in witchcraft of dried hands, and cultural history of lore and legends and things like that. I've listened all the way through season 1 and most of the way through season 2. I believe there's 3 or 4 seasons at this point. Season 1 is immaculate. Season 1 is before the podcast had gotten any attention, and so instead of having real ads, they recorded their own funny ads that were somehow related to the content of the episode. There's an episode about curse puppets, and so there was an ad for the person in the town who makes curse puppets for you to send boils and plagues to the people that you hate the most. My two favorite episodes from season 1 are actually the first 2 episodes, The Paris Catacombs, which is the very first episode, and Gargoyles, which is the second episode. And then in season 2, as far as I've gotten, my two favorite episodes have been Glorified Hands, which is the third episode, and Memento Mori, which is the 6th episode. If you love the idea of living in or even just visiting for a night, a dark and mysterious library that stands at the end of a forest that houses lots of mythical creatures and 2 very mysterious librarians, I can't also recommend this podcast enough. It is incredible. Next up is another podcast from the Exactly Right Network, which is the network run by Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. It's The Murder Squad with Jensen and Holes. This podcast is hosted by crime journalist Billy Jensen and forensic scientist and investigator Paul Holes, who is the man who caught the Golden State Killer back in 2016. And these guys present all of the details necessary on current cold cases for internet sleuths to be able to dig into the records that we have and try to make headway on these cases. The Murder Squad has actually made some significant impact on the solving of some cases by putting pressure on local authorities. They've caused cold cases to be reopened and reinvestigated with fresh eyes. They've actually uncovered real evidence that Billy and Paul have been able to submit to authorities. And it's just so exciting to kind of see it go down. I really wish that I knew how to be an internet sleuth. I actually have no clue, but I'm just happy to be here and witness it going on. With the Murder Squad, you can really start anywhere and see what you like. Scroll through the episodes if this sounds interesting to you and see if there is one that catches your attention. I just love the Exactly Right Network. Next up is Tenfold More Wicked by Kate Winkler Dawson, which is also on the Exactly Right Network. Kate Winkler Dawson is a journalism professor at the University of Texas. She is born and raised in Texas. She is also a writer of some true crime books. American Sherlock is one of them, and it is currently waiting on my Libby shelf for me. And now she's a podcaster. Kate Winkler Dawson has a particular passion for very old true crime cases. And so in Tenfold More Wicked, she puts together these multiple episode long stories about these old true crime cases that are absolutely fascinating. There are 3 seasons of the show out at this time. She also has another podcast called Wicked Words that is separate that I also enjoy, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Season 2 of Tenfold More Wicked is by far my favorite. I've talked about it on my channel before. It's called The Body Snatchers. It's about William Hare and William Burke, who were killing people and selling them to medical schools for profit. This was right at the beginning of the period of time where people were really starting to study anatomy, and so this covers the history of the black cadaver market. It's basically the beginning of the black cadaver market. Burke and Hare were selling these bodies to one specific professor, a man named Dr. Robert Knox, who had suspicions about what they were doing and basically knew exactly what was going on, but didn't care. He knew that he would take the bodies without question, and so did they. And so they were able to get away with it for several years. Kate Winkler Dawson has a buttery, soft, wonderful voice, and Tenfold More Wicked is for anyone who likes the more gritty side of history and who would like a really deep dive for several hour-long episodes about one particular case. And last but certainly not least, because I listen to it every night, is Nothing Much Happens by Kathryn Nicholai. This is my sleeping podcast. The tagline is bedtime stories for grown-ups, and nothing much happens. It takes place in the town of Nothing Much. Every episode is a different aspect of life in the village of Nothing Much, where nothing much happens, but everything is full of relaxing detail. You feel good, and then you fall asleep. That's me quoting from the podcast, if you couldn't tell by my inflection. My top 3 episodes that I listen to over and over are Toast and Marmalade, At the Mill with Pumpkins and Cider, and Closing Up Shop, which is the very first episode. If you need help falling asleep and you'd like to be told a bedtime story, I completely adore Nothing Much Happens. But yeah, those are all of my favorite podcasts that I'm going to share with you today. Seasons, series, episodes, all of that good stuff. I sincerely hope that you will check out one of the podcasts that I have listed here today. If you have listened to any of these podcasts or you have recommendations for me based on these ones that I've said that I love, please leave them in the comments below. I'm always looking for new podcasts. My one problem is that I'm so attached to My Favorite Murder that I have trouble listening to new podcasts, but I'm going to be making a really big attempt to listen to the backlog of podcasts that are saved in my Spotify. But that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you'll stick around for the next one. I hope that you're doing well. If you're not, I hope it gets better soon, and I hope that you love what you're reading or listening to. Goodbye!